To tell you this story, we have to go back to the ancient era of the early 2000s. I was in town with my dad, and he ducked around the corner to talk with someone while I waited behind in the car. He quickly returned, holding a second-hand PlayStation 1. The memory is distant enough that it's more like trying to conjure back a fading dream. I only recall that it didn't come with the box. The grey slab just sat on my lap while we drove home, and I watched the coastline of my hometown pass by out the window. Oh, and more importantly, I also remember the game that came with it. Final Fantasy VIII. I was stumbling around Balam Gardens before I could even read, which was a bit of a problem by the way. That game is very text-heavy. For many kids of this era, games were often defined by scarcity. I probably played the first 5 hours of Final Fantasy VIII about 100 times. Through a conviction to understand what on earth was going on in this thing, I can probably attribute my learning to read, in part at least, to this game. The retro-futuristic world and its characters taught me what cool would have meant to the average teenager in the 90s. I mean, you can't tell me Squall doesn't pull off the double belt look. And you wouldn't be out of line to point to the 3D era of Final Fantasy as pioneering cinematic storytelling in interactive media. I was immediately drawn into its gritty fantasy. To my tiny brain, the game felt, very literally, as detailed and substantial as the real world, as though if somehow I got transported into the TV, I could live out a full life in there. Final Fantasy VIII was the beginning of my interest in video games. I so frequently returned to its fantasy world while growing up that if I put my heavily scratched up copy of Disc 1 into the console it came with, it'll say, "That ain't happening, buddy." I say all of this not because my personal experience with Final Fantasy VIII is particularly special in some way, in fact exactly the opposite. Every experience shapes us bit by bit to turn us into the person we are, but it's often art which is the most potent. Perhaps it's through a different medium or at a different age, but everyone has their own version of this story. For a long time though, I thought this kind of story was relegated only to childhood, that going through a game world like this again would be impossible, since I only view Final Fantasy VIII through a filter of nostalgia and childlike agreeableness. Well, I was wrong. There is a game, today, that through storytelling and committed creativity recaptures the same kind of wonder, while simultaneously pulling off a seemingly impossible feat, breaking through the cynicism and guile of a fully formed adult. That game is Clair Obscur, Expedition 33. There are lots of parts in Clair Obscur's grief-laden story that I found myself connecting with, and I asked myself how much of this came intentionally as pre-packaged ideas from the writing, and how much was it just me reflecting on my own experiences. It's hard picking favourite quotes in Clair Obscur, but up there for me, and one that starts to answer this question, is the certified Renoir banger.
Art can be a window, and art can be a mirror. And great art is both.
With this, the game is making a claim that for creative work to be great, it must invite introspection from its audience while also being an honest and faithful expression of the perspectives and humanity that is the soul behind its creation. In making this claim, the game does not shy away from walking the walk, making an earnest attempt to live up to its own definition, and it begins by constructing a window into the human artists behind it, with an honest acknowledgement of the giant's shoulders upon which it stands. This game is dev studio Sandfall Interactive's first game. If you watch enough interviews with the game's creative director, Guillaume Broche, you'll find him talking about his favourite games that inspired Clair Obscur. The one he talks about the most, as it turns out, is Final Fantasy VIII. And this actually made a lot of sense to me. Playing through Sandfall's game, there absolutely is a Final Fantasy feeling woven throughout. Sometimes when I'm squinting just right, I think I might be looking at a Final Fantasy VIII remake or something, with its white fur collars, JRPG overworld, and turn-based combat. But of course, Expedition 33 is a lot more than a callback. Now, yeah, I know it's not exactly breaking news that a guy yapping about video games on the internet suddenly has a positive opinion about Expedition 33. There's a lot to talk about with this game, and I want to avoid simply going on a hysterical glazing tirade of simple value judgments despite my instincts. So when starting to try and pull it apart, what I find striking, especially when compared to the JRPGs that have inspired it, is that it lands a very complex and nuanced story, especially in how it approaches its ending, which let's put a pin in for now, because even in the opening and broad structure of the game, there are discussions about things like grief, loss, and family, but it broaches these topics with the same bewitching, you've never seen this before spectacle that a game like Final Fantasy VIII can do with a 4-year-old at the turn of the century. Now, human expression is a function of our personalities and values, things that are shaped by our environments and interactions. So, all creative work is fundamentally a product of inspiration. This isn't only applicable to Expedition 33 by any means, but where this game differs, from most video games at least, is by explicitly forming part of its own identity around acknowledging and celebrating its creative lineages. One of the strongest of these inspirations is the quote-unquote classic 3D era of Final Fantasy. This is your Final Fantasy VII through 10s. It's the high fidelity, for the time, elaborately cinematic, turn-based classic JRPG. This is a big reason why Expedition has exploded the way that it has. It fills this gap for which there hasn't really been a game in over 20 years, after Final Fantasy switched to a more general real-time open-world gameplay framework. Expedition 33 folds in design philosophies from a whole range of genres, but without the Final Fantasy lineage behind it, this game wouldn't exist at all, and the game squarely shows its awareness of this. We can see this by looking at the breadcrumbs left throughout the game itself. First and foremost, it allows itself to embody the full gamut party-based JRPG genre. Tell me if this sounds familiar. A group of chummy characters journey across a fantasy land to defeat an existential threat. The hardest boss in the game isn't the final boss, it's some random goon you stumble upon in the endgame, and a bunch of seemingly out-of-place minigames eventually Stockholm Syndrome you into playing them for hours on end. So yeah, I'd say Expedition 33 is an unapologetic JRPG beyond even just the turn-based combat. In fact, if we go back to Sandfall and look at their public-facing website, they're incredibly open about their inspirations. For each core member of the development team, alongside their name, job title, and headshot, equal importance is given to a list titling a handful of their favourite games. And yes, this includes Guillaume's Final Fantasy VIII. The studio doesn't shy from openly communicating the significance of its inspirations. Another example of this is in the way the game contains reinterpreted genre conventions for its world design. Particularly, I'm talking about the overworld, an inclusion which feels very fresh in the year 2025. The geographical abstraction allows the world to have an incredible sense of scale without needing to design a full-sized open world that lets you count how many trees are on the way to the next dungeon. And that miniature effect? That's super cool. It uses this really effective pseudo-tilt shift approach. You've probably seen this shallow depth of field camera technique that tricks the eye into making human-scale, real-world shots look like they're ant scale. Well, if you look at how it works in Expedition 33's overworld, a shallow depth of field is applied in a similar way, and with the top-down perspective, it makes it feel like you're walking around a bona fide toy diorama, filled densely with captivating art wherever you look. Now, it's not like turn-based JRPGs with a miniaturized overworld haven't existed since, Final Fantasy IX or anything like that. As recent as 2023, Sea of Stars was incorporating many of the classic Final Fantasy and Chrono Trigger-esque JRPG conventions that I've been talking about, including the overworld. This isn't lost on me, but there's something especially interesting about the fact that, again, Expedition 33 takes classic genre elements while also being this high-fidelity, cinematic, narrative-focused video game that there's nothing quite like in recent memory. Of course, there are plenty of other connections anyone who has a familiarity with the classic 3D Final Fantasies will also notice. If you take note of, for instance, the story pacing, the plot being framed around a group on a pilgrimage, and the character-focused storytelling, you can draw unmistakable parallels to Final Fantasy X. Then there are more specific nods. Every area in Final Fantasy VII, VIII, and IX was decorated beautifully with meticulously composed pre-rendered backdrops. Each new turn of the corner was like an artistic reward. Expedition 33 has incredible environments on its own, unbelievably creative stuff. But there are these optional side areas, usually where the music records are hidden, which are these panoramic, fixed-camera compositional works of art. This is just about the most literal that Expedition 33's homages get, but by including them, the game acknowledges the art which influenced its creation. See, the thing is, the game ends up evoking the charm of these classic JRPGs, not in really a nostalgic way, but by virtue of being completely and entirely its own thing. It balances its homages with creatively fresh personal takes on the genre, and on some even very specific design elements that come from its inspirations. I'll give you an example following the Final Fantasy VIII comparison. Very early on in Expedition 33, you'll come across Pictos and Luminas, items that are fundamental to the game's combat. Pictos are essentially passive combat abilities you equip to each character, something like starting combat with health regeneration, or dealing double damage at low health, but there's a hard limit of 3 equip slots. With Lumina, however, there is no limit to how many Pictos-derived abilities you can activate. You just need to have used them enough to have unlocked them as Lumina abilities and have the required number of Lumina points. So instead of equipping armor and accessories to modify your stats like in a standard RPG, the Pictos Lumina system opens up a deep build crafting operation that the game requires you to engage with if you want to truly succeed in fights. You collect more Lumina points throughout the game, so the system expands significantly as you progress. It's a constantly humming engine which drives combative strategy outside of the combat encounters themselves and gives a varied sense of self-expression in how you define your team for combat. And when taken to its extreme, it feels like breaking the game in your favor by designing an insanely synergistic build that can obliterate enemies if you line things up properly. Turning back to Final Fantasy VIII, well, it's always been a bit of a black sheep in the franchise. It didn't capture the same critical or commercial success as its predecessor. The reasons for this are broad and complicated, I'm not going to go there, but one of the major causes is the implementation of what the game calls the junction system. Okay, let me try to explain this. The short story is that you get these Guardian Forces, or GFs for short, which are the game's summons, and they can be equipped or junctioned, hence the name junction system, to party characters, providing stat upgrades to help in combat. These stat boosts are tied to each GF's abilities, and they learn more abilities the more you fight in battles. The standard JRPG combat spells you can cast, well, they can also then be junctioned to particular stat upgrades associated with a GF ability to make them more effective, and either larger stacks of spells or more powerful spells will further increase the effectiveness of the stat boost. If that all sounds confusing, you don't know the half of it. The biggest problem with the junction system was its poor tutorialization, the overuse of jargon, and unclear naming conventions, which together made how it works extremely opaque. And to make matters worse, designing powerful builds isn't easy without a guide, and getting reasonably strong through junctioning requires a lot of tedium in how it incentivizes constantly drawing spells in combat encounters instead of, fighting. And even then, it incentivizes you to not even use those spells in combat. Broadly speaking though, the junction system in Final Fantasy VIII is an elaborately ambitious replacement for the typical armor and accessories in standard JRPGs that aims to deliver a great deal of player expression. At least some use of the system is necessary to succeed in combat because you can't just farm XP as the enemies scale and level with you. And fully engaging with the junction system allows you to practically break the game and absolutely clam anyone that gets in your way. So in its structure, you can find stark similarities between the junction system here and the Lumina system in Expedition 33. Now, to be clear, the Lumina system is absolutely not just an updated junction system. It's its own thing, and mechanically, you could even argue it works more similarly to Final Fantasy IX's ability equipping. And admittedly, I'm more primed to see the Final Fantasy VIII influence here as well. But it's the feeling, not so much the form of what the junction system was trying to achieve, that is found in Expedition 33. It comes off as though Expedition 33 was designed with the goal of creating a game that gave the same feeling as playing something like Final Fantasy VIII when it was new, but with a much more contemporary design. The Lumina system is just one example of this. In creative work, verisimilitude is an approach in which a subject is recreated as exactly as possible to its real form. It's the lifelikeness of art. And for what it's worth, here is the final major spoiler warning for Expedition 33. In the game, at the start of Act 3, Maëlle regains the memories of how the painted world inside the canvas came to be, and with everyone inside having just been erased, she tries to paint her friends back to life. As she attempts this initially, she struggles since she's not a gifted painter like her parents. Verso then approaches with some advice, saying,
"Painting isn't about verisimilitude, it's about essence."
I told you it's hard picking quotes. Anyway, the game backs this perspective up directly by doing exactly that. It creates this feeling, this essence of a very specific type of classic JRPG without simply bringing over its exactness. But the game isn't just for the Final Fantasy weebs who are able to see these specific connections. The game is clearly adored very broadly, but to have done this, it's still important that the game has been so open about its JRPG lineage. As the game claims, great art is a window and a mirror, and by wearing its creative lineages openly, anyone who plays the game will see the fingerprints left behind. Through an intimacy with the creative process behind it, it becomes impossible not to connect with the humanity within the game. What makes this work is that only the best parts of many other games are allowed to make it in, and they enter in ways that get the medium of video games. It reminds me a lot of Tunic, a throwback isometric action game that tries to evoke your childlike curiosity, getting you to figure out its mechanics and quests from an untranslated manual. Tunic channels its inspirations from old Legend of Zelda games by recreating the feel of the classic series, not through just its gameplay, but with a whole lot of its core symbolic elements and overall style. Expedition 33 does this in a similar way with Final Fantasy, containing interpretations and expressions of the shape of its inspirations while making something entirely new out of them. The product of a creative work is in itself a story of its production. It is exactly the people who made it. The unfiltered reverence for the material which inspired Expedition 33 tells the story about the interests, the passions, and the personalities that brought the game to life. In this way, the game comes off as extremely complete, in the sense that it feels as though it's exactly what it wants to be, and it's what it wants to be because it is the unfiltered people behind it. And inevitably, I'm at the point where it's basically impossible to not talk about the story of how this game got made, because that story is as incredible as the game itself. Guillaume Broche began by tinkering around in Unreal Engine while employed at Ubisoft. This drummed up an appetite to make a game himself, and he took the risk to just go and do it. Then, the writer of the game, Jennifer Svedberg-Yen, was a hobbyist writer working at a private equity firm before joining the team, and Expedition 33 is not just her first published writing in a video game, but her first published writing, full stop. Oh, and she didn't even initially join the team as a writer. She joined as a temporary voice actor after responding to a Reddit post asking for people to provide voice acting for a pitch trailer of a precursor game called We Lost. And no, she's not a voice actress either. The person who just decided, fuck it, I'll do some voice acting, why not, happened to be such a talented writer, her role on the team just changed. Then there's the composer, Laurent Testard, and I haven't even talked about the music in this game yet, which is game-defining work. But Laurent was serendipitously discovered by Guillaume on a niche indie video game music forum, which neither of them had ever even used before. The formation of this initial team is a genuine miracle, the conviction of a group of people who, as far as video game experience is concerned, had no place making an actual Game of the Year tier video game, seemingly willed the thing into existence. But it's a story about people coming together because they wanted to be part of something meaningful, and that's exactly what the finished product feels like, and more importantly, it's exactly why it feels that way too. Looking at the story of the game's creation in its broad strokes, two things start to really make sense. Firstly, it becomes clear where the extremely unique creative identity came from. I'm talking about how goddamn French it is, how captivatingly unusual the premise and art style is, and of course, how it's chosen to adapt its inspirations. This is a group of people who were figuring things out as they went and creating with minimal constraints to their vision. Secondly, it becomes clear how such a deep understanding of the craft shines through Expedition 33. The universal acclaim received by Expedition 33 can be attributed to the open respect it has for its inspirational material, since it helps it to feel like the work of individual human beings. But realistically, it has a lot more to do with how unlike it is to standard turn-based JRPGs. The game goes far beyond a love letter to a genre. A thorough understanding of games as a medium has allowed the people at Sandfall to make what feels like a reinvention of the standard turn-based affair. This game delivers the most satisfying turn-based combat I've ever personally experienced because of how refined and well integrated each branch of the combat system is. There are sort of two key branches here. The first is the very distinct gameplay system that each playable character gets in combat. This is the synergistic 4 element slots Lune has, the dramatic damage and defense boosts of Mael's combat stances, the foretell stacks that CL can build up on enemies, that kind of stuff. When I first saw the tutorials coming up for each character, I thought, here we go, character gimmicks. But these combat styles are a fundamental mode of the combat. Every character feels so completely unique in their gameplay, which prevents encounters from ever feeling repetitive or stale in the short-term gameplay loop across any given battle, or in the longer-term loops across a full playthrough. In the short-term view, each unique system asks you to use a different area of your brain each time you switch character, where at one moment you've got to put Mael in the right stance for a follow-through attack next turn, and the next you're trying to decide whether an earth or an ice stain will let you deal more damage in 2 turns' time as Lune. But then each character subsystem is focused enough that it's also never overwhelming. And then in the long term, your whole party inherits a distinct dynamic depending on which 3 characters, and thus which 3 systems, are put together. So there's a great deal of variety and personalization to your whole party combat build. And then together, the short and long-term combat loops give the gameplay a great deal of depth. The second key branch of combat, and the one that really gives it its satisfying quality, is, of course, the parry-dodge system. You cannot tell me that just making it through an impossible fight by downloading the enemy's attack pattern at the last minute and deleting them with the crunch of a parry isn't one of the best feelings in video games. This part of the combat comes straight from another unabashed inspiration, Sekiro, a game that Guillaume Broche used to speedrun, so it's fair to say he probably likes it. Now, I would go and say it's not at all an intuitive approach to combine the combat of Sekiro and a turn-based Final Fantasy game together. These are 2 diametric opposites on the mechanical twitch reflex scale. But lo and behold, it works fucking brilliantly. Not because they're meant to be together. No, it's because the best parts of each system have been carefully and coherently slotted into each other by people who understand why each aspect works as a way to make a video game rewarding and engaging. It's a direct reply to the most common complaint against the premise of turn-based combat, that it's boring menu hopping, about as engaging as browsing through the picture settings on a TV. And I don't agree with that, of course, but the idea keeps people from jumping into this genre of combat. So by making active elements that require engaged attention such a fundamental part of the combat, the encounters become very different from the traditional turn-based framework, while still feeling turn-based. It certainly helps that with the Persona-style UI, any action you want is, at most, 2 buttons away, and the Souls-like checkpoints which restock your consumables and health prevents any fiddly menu scrolling for party management. It streamlines the systems to feel like you're only ever dealing with the best bits of every type of combat that's been borrowed into the game. In terms of its presentation, the combat just oozes with crunchiness and style. There's the snappy camera movements through the action menus as everyone stands there, aura farming. There's the elegant UI design and, my god, the action animations that make every move feel like a nuclear bomb went off. And on top of all this, the opening of every encounter is accented with the high points of a battle theme. Mechanically, it feels strategic and reflex-driven, but then everything is boxed up and delivered in this fantasy epic grandiose package. Of course, there's also the crazy builds you can make that I mentioned earlier. So there's combat strategy that occupies your mind well outside of the actual combat encounters. Because to actually pull off the ridiculous 7-digit damage numbers needed to get through some of the endgame bosses, you have to get really good at the Lumina system, where the whole point, intentionally built into the game, is to beat impossible fights by breaking the game on a mathematical level. It feels like cheating to equip 24 Lumina abilities that all stack to exponentially ratchet up your damage, but there's a level of competitive satisfaction that you get from the feeling of having outsmarted the game that adds to the whole excitement of combat. Then, this is supplemented with the First Strike system, which is completely at home in this game. Being able to sneak up on enemies to get the first turn is the ultimate proof that the game understands its own combat framework. Before the battle screen is even up, you feel like you've got the upper hand over the game systems already. It all comes together to make the combat feel just good to engage with. It's got depth, it's satisfying, it's fun, because it knows exactly what it is. In between combat, there's also a different kind of gameplay: exploration. And guess what? Yeah, it's also great. I don't know how they do it. Once again, this game takes the approach of merging a range of different design philosophies and only taking the parts that work really well together. There's the overworld, of course, it's the classic Homage, it's got the cool tilt shift, yada yada. But in terms of how it fits into the gameplay, it uses the restraint of foregoing any minimaps, map markers, or location to-do lists to try and make the exploration feel like, well, exploration. Finding optional dungeons and journal collectibles is genuine discovery, and you have to mentally keep track of where you've been and where things are. This is something I, at least personally, vibe really well with, since the self-motivated exploration forced me to develop a deep familiarity with the overworld map, which in turn makes it feel like a real place with a sense of presence, even though it's as abstract as a geographic location can be. Now, to be honest, it can get a little irritating at the very end game if you're trying to go through everything on offer and you can't remember whether or not you've already been to a tiny cavern tucked deep into the corner of the overworld. There's a good argument to be made for at least some in-game tracking at the back end, but it really comes down to a lot of subjective preference. Do you want to get the checklist completionist stuff over and done with ASAP, or do you want to be encouraged to explore like an actual expedition would? At the very least, the design decision is a clear choice with intent behind it that I can respect. Ultimately, for the majority of my stay on the continent, I can say that the way exploration applies the abstract overworld is very damn effective. It continues into the exploration within dungeons too. A ubiquitous video game design scheme is to provide reward incentives for poking around and exploring a game world, which makes sense since navigating a digital environment is one of the most basic building blocks of video games. In Expedition 33 though, these collectibles are usually brilliantly written previous expedition logs or Lumina points, which feed into the way that you break the combat build system, so exploring levels in detail almost always rewards the player in some substantial way. Apart from maybe the occasional chroma currency pickup, nothing feels like filler, which is insane to have pulled off given the quantity of these collectibles throughout the world. Does Clair Obscur have any flaws though? Well, there's no such thing as a perfect game, so yes, of course. If you need them pointed out, well, for me at least, 1, the character configuration UI is kinda cluttered. 2, there's no way to track combat builds, so the on-the-fly changes to counter particular enemies and use the combat system to its fullest extent annoyingly isn't really encouraged. And 3, the minigames highlight the areas where the game happens to lack polish. God damn it. But that's all these things are, a matter of polish. There aren't really any fundamental missteps that I can point to, and I've really thought about this. I bring these up to emphasize that this game is made by people who really clearly understand the medium and how to use it. Exploration ties into the combat, ties into the setting and themes, and makes it all feel like venturing on an expedition. On the whole, all of Clair Obscur's gameplay systems feel like they've been built on the back of decades of inspiration using elements from many different sources that, in their own right, all work independently, no question. But then, in implementation, have been refined and integrated into a final result that somehow works in a JRPG. It captures the essence of what makes turn-based combat engaging and exciting, what makes overworld exploration rewarding and compelling, and it's all still delivered in a way that feels new and refreshing. So yeah, Clair Obscur nails its gameplay across the board, but there's a lot more it has going for it. I've only just scratched the surface. I think now it's probably time to talk about the music in this game, because holy shit, it is incredible all-timer material, seriously. It's not often you hear a track in a game first time and immediately know you're going to be listening to it for many years to come. When the narrative called for a sequence where the characters become entranced by the hypnotic beauty of a lyrical siren call song, the composer just went and actually made a hypnotically enchanting composition, which is one of the most soothing pieces on the entire 8-hour, 174-track OST. The way the music is integrated into the story, the gameplay, and the world design, it's all expert class. Something I can never stop noticing about the music is how texturally distinct ambient tracks are between different environments. In the surreal underwater level, the soundtrack feels like water drops turned into music. and in the aforementioned Siren level, all the tracks are melodic and flowy in the same way that the boss of that sequence is. The way the composition covers a range of environmental languages like this feels almost retro. Like how musical flourishes accent the world in classic Legend of Zelda games, or how the soundtracks in traditional 3D mascot platformers would reflect the culture of the level environments rather than being purely ambient, trying not to be distracting. Not only is Lorian Testar here clearly a talented composer, but he understands exactly how music can interface uniquely with video games. So then, the gameplay and the music are both incredible achievements. To an astonishing level too, but this game is a runaway hit, with people calling it a masterpiece. And look, I wouldn't dare to try and define what makes something a masterpiece. It's more of a vibe than anything, but I can tell you, it never happens by just getting one thing right. A masterpiece comes about when all of its elements resonate in concert. It's got to do all its bits well, and they all need to play off of one another to give that better than the sum of its parts feeling. And this is what makes Clair Obscur special. Not because it does any one thing particularly well, but because all of its gameplay elements are masterpieces in ways that raise the tide for everything around it. For instance, the game is obsessed with duality and poetic symmetry. It's everywhere. There's the art style of the game, which evenly contrasts two distinct French styles, the natural and flowy artistic forms from the Art Nouveau movement against sharp and geometric Art Deco stylings. Then there's the whole pilgrimage the plot follows, which is from Lumiere to the monolith, before ending things where they began, with a trip from the monolith back to Lumiere in Act 3. There's Verso's name coming from recto verso, Latin terms for the front and back of a sheet or a canvas. And the game is called Clair Obscur, for God's sakes. This is the French expression for chiaroscuro. It's a technical art term describing the use of strong contrasts between light and dark in visual compositions to enhance the sense of depth and volume, which the game does not hesitate to use itself. I could quite literally talk for hours about the various ways the game incorporates ideas and imagery of duality, but an especially pointed example is this really cool way it's used in the music. The first battle music you hear in the game is a track called Our Drafts Unite. Which, how does the game get away with opening on a track that goes this incredibly hard? Anyway, this track is a modified section of a much longer piece, Our Drafts Collide, which plays in the very final battle of the game. So there's a nice poetic bookending of the music across the game. But what makes this really interesting is that at the same time, the opening battle, scored by Our Drafts Unite, is a fight between Maëlle and her adopted brother. Then, the final battle track of the game, Our Drafts Collide, plays over the fight between Maëlle/Alicia and her actual brother. In doing so, the musical symmetry is used to tie together the structural symmetry of the narrative as well as the gameplay symmetry of the battles between central playable characters, and with all of these in harmony, the final moment ends up feeling complete and significant without you ever really noticing exactly why, and the whole game is a bunch of this all the time. To execute on this level of cohesiveness is much easier said than done. It comes from having a serendipitously talented team made up of the right people and talents sharing a common passion for a focused vision. It can't be made in a factory. It can't be bankrolled into existence. It's people working together to get their genuine and human ideas seen. And it's why, with just a AA scale production operating on what is likely less than 1/10 of a AAA blockbuster title, it's still able to easily trade blows with its bigger budget brethren. This is all to say, this game is a legitimate miracle. The fact that all of its pieces are this good, and it's a first release for a new studio, and it follows from an incredibly serendipitous story about the team's formation, just makes you want to root for it even more. A video game, or any artistic creation for that matter, is just the people who make it. No more, no less. A window into the souls who constructed it. So, having established that everything in Clair Obscur is working harmoniously together, it's time now to turn to the narrative and ask what makes this part of the game so special. And the opening of the game gives us a perfect place to start digging at. That is, the lean setup into the big narrative hook. The very first thing the game does is pan across a surreal Parisian city, which looks towards a towering monolith looming above with a giant glowing number. All the characters introduced in the opening talk to each other about the monolith, about expeditions to reach it, and the mission to stop whatever it is that it's doing. It takes some time as you explore the city during its Homage festival, but eventually you realise, by seeing it with your own eyes, that the somber celebration you're a part of commemorates the annual event where the paintress, a giant woman at the monolith, paints a new number and erases everyone of that age. A doomsday clock permanently hangs over the city, ticking down to the inevitable eradication of its population. The theatrical quality of the hook and the natural human characters that quickly deliver emotional stakes make the narrative so incredibly compelling so early on. And then following the opening, every dimension of the writing continues to live up to this premise. The first thing I noticed was the really refreshing approach to dialogue. There's a really stark naturalism to the dialogue in Clair Obscur, which I don't know that I've ever quite seen in a video game. It feels more akin to a screenplay in a premium budget TV show or a character drama film. There's a sense that the writing really respects the intelligence of its audience, doing a lot of show don't tell. There are moments in conversations where characters are just straight up silent, and that is exactly what they're saying, conveying as much meaning as a page-long monologue.
Do you still believe that?
One of the best examples of the general naturalism in the dialogue is right at the beginning of the game, between Gustave and Sophie. The setup makes it clear that they haven't spoken in a very long time. They stammer and cut each other off.
You know, I'm sorry that... I
You
miss
don't need to... Okay.
You go.
No, you...
This isn't traditional, clear, crisp dialogue. It feels like watching two actual people having an awkward, emotionally honest reunion. They don't expose their entire history for the audience, yet this scene manages to provide a deep understanding of their relationship in an unbelievably short amount of time. And so, when Sophie is erased in the Homage, a tangible relationship has been affected. Throughout the whole game, important plot points and messages are delivered through subtext, and there's no dipping into ironic detachment or self-protective irony to make it easier to casually engage with. The writing is fully confident in itself, wanting you to take it seriously. Another great moment of the game is the argument between Gustave and Lune. This takes place slightly further into the game, past the beach landing sequence, after the expedition have been eviscerated and split up. They stumble upon a suspicious message with Maël's location, and they have to decide on whether or not to trust the message and venture out to find her.
This message feels off. If it was an expeditioner, they would have stayed here. Everyone knows the protocol.
Right, but they may have been in danger. Maybe this location has been compromised. Things change in the field.
There's a reason.
Protocol doesn't cover every contingency.
There's
You know that.
There's a reason it's protocol. We designed it to yield the optimal result in the vast majority of situations.
The dispute between Gustave and Lune here feels like a genuine clash of two personalities. Of course, Lune chooses to adhere to protocol. She's the rational academic. And of course, Gustave wants to venture out. He's the optimistic idealist. These two valid choices are in direct contention with each other, something the game loves to do all the time. After all,
Life keeps forcing cruel choices.
but the way this contention is handled by the writing is to put these two human characters together and have their genuine convictions drive the conversation. Instead of articulating clear rational points in turn, their perspectives colour their reactions to whatever's just been said, and it becomes more flustered and personal as the conversation goes on. It feels like Lune and Gustave aren't frustrated with each other because they want things their own way, but because they're struggling to communicate what's going on in their head to the other person, and they can't break through that divide. And the argument only resolves when Gustave appeals to Lune's intellectual view of the world, when he questions whether following protocol truly can arrive at the best possible circumstances. Now, the plot in Clair Obscur is interesting, no doubt, but it becomes super compelling when this kind of tension is constantly introduced. Pressure will simmer and build in a scene to draw out the emotions of each character, who themselves believe are acting rationally, but are fundamentally guided by their personal perspectives. This is how real people communicate, and it's almost uncanny the exactness with which the writing captures it. For me, it all clicked when I heard Jennifer Svedberg-Yen describe her writing style as the ultimate role-playing game in an interview with the Game Maker's Notebook.
But it becomes a lot easier once I started just figuring out the right entry point, and I kind of roughly know where we want them to go, but then I just literally let the characters react to each other. So it's I always say this somewhat as a joke, but not as a joke. Writing to me is an RPG because you are literally role-playing every single character, and you are letting them react to the catalyst. And if you have the right catalyst, the scene just sort of writes itself. So
what also helps the writing feel fresh and natural is the maturity of the characters, both in age and in personality. Well, at least when compared to the cast of spiky-haired teenagers in traditional JRPGs, all going on well-trodden heroes' journeys and coming-of-age arcs. Let's go back to Lune, for instance. She's the closest thing to a seasoned academic in Lumiere, and she isn't someone figuring out who she is. She already knows. She's analytical, but not in a tropey human-computer way. Instead, her emotions are always informed by her analytical approach to the world around her. It's why her adherence to protocol feels like an emotionally honest conviction, and a way for the player to view the complicated situations from a range of well-established perspectives. Shifting view towards the whole group of expeditioners, it's unique that they're comprised of tinkerers and researchers rather than seasoned brawlers. It adds to what makes the game feel so grounded and believable character-wise. Well, that is except for how goddamn sexy everyone's voices are.
Oh, you mean, adventure?
You know, sometimes I dream about Ben Starr narrating my life. Well, anyway, that's not important. What is important is that, genuinely, real-world exploration was typically done by people with notepads and sketchbooks, and the further spans of human exploration done today are by people with advanced science backgrounds. Jennifer touches on this herself in the Game Maker's Notebook interview.
Again, random. I did this NASA program where I was a analog astronaut. We were simulating a mission to an asteroid and back. And so that gave me a lot of ideas about how would a mission be structured. You know, like if it is a mission into the unknown, it is going to be more research oriented because they need to gather information. So that's one of the reasons why our expedition isn't so much made up of warriors, right? It's not like a team of soldiers. It's actually Gustav's an engineer. Lune is a researcher, and Ciel, she was a farmer and then later became a teacher. You know, like everybody had like real roles.
So seeing the path being laid by a group of researchers in Clair Obscur make the expedition feel like, well, an actual expedition, exploring a new and strange world. And it isn't just the 33. The environmental storytelling covers the discoveries made by past expeditions too, and coming across their journal entries makes the world outside of Lumiere feel rich in history and context, despite how cut off the city is from everything else. I get deeply invested in the 3 or so paragraphs of journal text whenever I come across the bizarre aftermath of a previous group's adventure. Like Expedition 44, who try, and fail, to avoid Nevrons by dressing in their carcasses like in a zombie movie or something. Or there's Expedition 40, who invent gliders and discover that trying to cross the barrier in front of the monolith gamages you away. Between the dialogue and the world building, the writing is supporting an impressively heavy load, but it doesn't end there. The cinematography also carries the kind of quality you'd expect in a premium TV project, like how the beach landing sets the tone of the game brilliantly. Just after the setup in Lumiere, Gustave's politician sister gives an inspiring monologue about the heroic journey about to commence.
As you sail into the unknown, know that Lumiere stands with you. When you battle the Paintress, know that Lumiere fights with you.
Expedition 33 then officially sets off on ship for the long journey towards the monolith. The title card drops. Then, the most bleak and uncomfortable cutscene of the game, barring the ending, plays out. An eclipse shrouds everything in dark, and sea mist brings down a deep fog as the ship lands on a beach just outside the boundary of Lumiere. A strange man stamps down his cane, punctuating the cuts to black, driving up the chilling feeling of the arrival. There's confusion in the air, and when questioned, instead of a response from the mysterious man, he brings hell down on the entire expedition, and what follows is some kind of combination of eldritch horror and the grimmest moments of a World War II movie. There's a cut to black, and Act 1 begins. What I love about this moment of the game is how sharply and succinctly it establishes so many fundamentals. It tells the player that there's an impossibly powerful villain in the way other than the Paintress. There's a new mystery surrounding the white-haired man, clearly older than he should be. And now the world outside Lumiere, and hence the mission itself, is exponentially more dangerous than anyone was able to fathom. Then Broadscope, the stark contrast between this and the hopefulness of the initial departure, cements the feeling that from here on out, one cannot ever get too comfortable. The flurry of revelations on top of the crushing tonal shift makes it feel as though understanding the mysteries of the outside world is not just a convenient side quest for the expedition, but that it's a matter of life and death just as much as stopping the Paintress. As though the mission is equally about understanding why she is. Why does she paint the numbers? What's going on out in the continent? And what happened to the world to cause Lumiere to fragment across the landscape? All of these questions are eventually answered, and it all has to do with the Dysandra family who exist outside of the canvas, outside of the world that the expeditioners inhabit. Of course, the first act of the game follows Gustave and Lune venturing out to find Maëlle. Then they come across Ciel, a farmer turned teacher turned expeditioner. Then a very solemn death for Gustave has Verso take his place as a new party member in Act 2, and Monoko, an ancient Gestrel, joins the expedition to help Verso end the Doomsday cycle with the rest of the 33. The expedition then reaches its high point at the monolith itself, where they defeat the Paintress in a moment that's oddly bittersweet. The expedition returns home for a reunion that just seems too good to be true, and of course it is, as everyone, even the young, gamage away at the same time, leaving only Maëlle and Verso in their wake. It turns out that they're special, different to everyone else in Lumiere. They're part of the Dysandra family, who created the world that Lumiere inhabits, all painted on a supernatural canvas that brings its subjects to life. So why was there so much misery, grief, and loss if there was a family of artists at the helm? Before the creation of Lumiere, the death of real-world Verso in a house fire fragmented the family, a stake driven between them made from the conflicting ideologies on how to process grief. The deepest wedge being between Verso's mother and father, Aline and Renoir. It was Aline, as it turns out, who created Lumiere and its people, and she manifested in the canvas as the Paintress. She became lost deep in a world where she could paint to life her family as they were before the fire, except I suppose Maëlle, using an old canvas originally painted by Verso. The people of Lumiere gamage away each year as she tries to sustain her creations against the powers of Renoir, who aim to strike them from the canvas instead. I have a bit of a confession to make. I spoke earlier about the symbolic use of duality throughout Clair Obscur to blend together its various game elements, but I buried the lead here a bit. Sure, the heavy poetic symmetry helps to make everything feel cohesive and well-paced, with stronger narrative weight at the endpoints of plot threads, like starting and ending the game with a battle between brother and sister, or Gustave's first and last moments being throwing his rocks towards the monolith with Maëlle. But it's more significant than that, because every single event in the game, the whole existence of the world in which it takes place, has been spun out of the conflict between Aline and Renoir. Whenever the game is using symbolic dualism, it's referring to these two people. By injecting a broken symmetry to every dimension of the game, everything feels like it has a bespoke purpose, because they're representations of some aspect of the contention keeping a husband and wife apart. There's not a single cutscene or breath ever wasted. After the big narrative revelation, the characters making up Expedition 33 take on a whole new role. Each provide a different outlook on grief, loss, and the broader conflict between Aline and Renoir. They're a cast of perspectives on the foundational driving contention in Clair Obscur. If you imagine even one of the expeditioners were removed from the narrative, there would be a substantial thematic loss. There's no waste here, as everyone has something interesting to add. Take Lune, for example. She embodies the we continue and lay the path philosophy that fuels the expeditions, and it makes perfect sense. In Lune's own words, her parents only had her in the first place so that they could raise a research assistant, and so that's what she became. But she doesn't necessarily agree with it. It was also a self-serving act of pushing the responsibility of one's own desires and goals onto their children without considering whether or not they even wanted that. And in the Dissandra conflict, this is exactly what Aline is doing, creating a painted Verso to process her own grief, regardless of whether it's what Verso would want for his own canvas, let alone for his own painted existence. Ciel and Minoko also pass their own views on the matter, on the lengths some people would go to see their loved ones again. Ciel discusses this explicitly in Act 3 after the canvas revelation.
Oh, please. I'd sacrifice you in a heartbeat to get him back. So, I understand. We're good.
Ciel understands everything that has gone on, that Verso betrayed the expedition to save Aline, yet she bears no grudge, because she empathizes with him. She'd be willing to make whatever sacrifice necessary to bring back Pierre. So from her empathetic perspective, decisions that can otherwise seem reprehensibly selfish are reframed as emotionally obvious decisions. Just like Verso's betrayal of the expedition, or Aline's commitment to maintaining the cycle of suffering in the canvas, and even Renoir's willingness to erase everything in the canvas so that he can have his wife back. Then, for Minoko, after losing Noko, he decides to cut in line to resurrect him earlier than he should at the Gestrel Sacred River. Minoko reflects the notion that loss is personal, and when fate deals an unfair blow, rules and conventions no longer matter. The deep histories of these characters and how grounded they are help to unravel the complicated emotions in the conflict between Aline and Renoir. On the surface, grief is the driving force of their divide, but the character writing covers a whole range of themes very competently. For example, there are ideas of struggling to find where you belong in the world, as we see in Maël's compulsion to leave Lumiere. There are feelings of nihilism about the future, as Lumiere becomes less and less hopeful about the expeditions ever working as the years tick down. There's also the presence of family strife everywhere you look in this game. If you're a human being from the planet Earth, I assure you, it would be nigh impossible to not find something to connect with deeply here. To say my relationship with my dad has changed since he handed me my first console would be a bit of an understatement. Watching the way Verso navigates his interactions with his father was downright uncanny for me. Verso talks about dyeing the white out of his hair to distance his association with his father, and at one point you watch him hold a languid conversation with Renoir he's clearly had many times before about wanting different things, to go his own way. I was seeing Verso go through a lot of the same feelings I know I felt before, delivered with a great deal of emotional honesty. The thing is, whenever the story happens upon an emotionally sensitive topic, it's always handled with such poise and empathy that it's very easy to connect to. The game's humanity is a window, but its power lies in its ability to also be a mirror. It shows you its soul, and in return, it asks you to show it yours. One of my favourite things a video game can do is to pull off some kind of gameplay mechanic or sequence that just dovetails right into the storytelling. Sometimes it's simple things like in The Last of Us, when Ellie refuses to respond to your triangle input to boost up a wall, or it can be the whole mechanical structure of a game, like in the ending to Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons. If you know, you know. A synergy between the gameplay and the narrative is what sets video games apart as a storytelling art form. Clair Obscur is a game that just gets this. It's been created with a deep understanding of the medium, and it's only games with this understanding that are able to combine gameplay and narrative really effectively. There are examples I can pull from dotted throughout the whole game. For instance, you'll regularly come across these white Nevrons who look slightly different to their combative counterparts. They usually give a story about how they feel out of place, created without the will to fight, unlike the rest of their kind. As a player, you have the choice to help them out with a small unique side quest, and once you do, you're provided another choice in whether you want to fight them. The whole quest chain ends with a final white Nevron rewarding you if you chose to both help and spare all the others you encountered. It's a small bit of side narrative that ties into the themes of finding your place in the world, shared by many of the main characters. Crucially though, it rewards your empathy towards these creatures you otherwise only know to be hostile. And you're not told there's a reward, and it's given after like 30 hours of poking around the whole continent to find them. It isn't simply a renegade paragon video gamey moral choice. It's a gentle acknowledgement of whether you chose to be kind when no other incentives were offered. In a game about exploring the borders of different characters' perspectives on very personal subject matter, acknowledging the empathy a player might show for their enemies feels like a broad scope answer to a lot of the game's questions. It's not about what the quote-unquote right way to process grief is, but rather that other people's experiences will inform their perspectives differently to yours, and empathy can help bridge that gap. And, unlike any other conventional medium, it's only in a video game that a player's own human behaviour can be a participant in the story. Linking together gameplay and narrative is also used plenty in the mainline plot, often to enhance progression and pacing. I really like how Verso keeps Sori, that's the rock that lets SK fly, hidden until after the Paintress was taken down, afraid that the expedition might abandon the mission and return to Lumiere if given the chance. With this bit of writing, the gameplay progresses naturally, without the need for a plot contrivance, and also tees up a revealing and internally consistent element of Verso's manipulative side. But for me, the best demonstration of how the pacing of the gameplay and story link together comes just after the beginning of Act 2, and I'm just obsessed with it. At this point in the story, Gustave has just died at the hands of Renoir, and Verso has joined the expedition, but the group decides to press on towards the monolith. The only path is through a dreary abandoned battlefield where the sun cuts through the thick dust, and literal mounds of bodies from past expeditions form trenches across the wasteland. But through the whole level, the gameplay design is telling the same story as the imagery. Trudging through the visually bleakest environment the game ever delivers, surrounded by literal death, the whole expedition is mourning the loss of Gustave. And in all this, Maëlle is especially affected. This moment in the game is pretty much its lowest emotional point. Mechanically speaking, there's also someone new in the party replacing Gustave, which already feels strange enough as it is, but now I have to start a whole new skill tree from scratch? I don't even know this guy, and I'm having to learn new combat mechanics? Is this really the time? Then, after marching through the aftermath of a World War II-esque trench warfare battle, and also watching an argument break out between Maëlle and the rest of the group in how to properly emotionally process the loss of Gustave, the game literally pulls the ground out from underneath the team to have them descend into a massive pit with one of the most Dark Souls boss fights in the game. Now, this concept of a physical descent to match an emotional one is not uncommon in video games. It's one of the best ways to match level design to the narrative. It's why sewer levels used to be a gaming staple, and the descent here is used at the perfect moment in Clair Obscur. As the game loves to do, the tension of the situation drives a dispute amongst the expedition. As this tension peaks, and before any resolution can take place, the characters are forced into a dire boss battle in a literal pit of death. This is the gameplay delivering tension to the player in order to punctuate the narrative tension among the group. The gameplay set piece is doing almost as much storytelling as the actual cutscenes and dialogue. So then, one of the coolest boss fights plays out, and of course it's a two-phase affair, and it ends with this unique finisher animation of the whole expedition pulling off a cool anime-level finishing move to defeat the duelist together. He falls, and instead of some big monologue about how we've all learned to understand each other and work together, the player is made to simply and silently climb out of the death pit themselves, wordless amends made between everyone in the expedition. Then, something else the game loves to do, especially after moments of emotional weight, is to give the player long empty walks, digital treadmills forcing you to sit uncomfortably in the unease of the situation. And in this case, the walk ends at Gustave's burial. Now, I don't think I can imagine changing a single thing about this entire sequence to have it more effectively handle the emotional tension of Gustav's death. For me, it had been several real-life hours since his demise, allowing a build-up of unresolved tension as arguments grew and the gameplay ramped up before finally being addressed at his burial. This is a great deal of restraint on the game's behalf to not try and bring in some closure immediately after his fatal moment. The game instead trusts that the player is invested enough that it can play around with the discomfort of the situation for the next few hours to really make the burial scene as impactful as possible. Then we arrive. This is probably the most emotionally crushing moment of the whole game, and it really turns up the thermostat on the feeling of loss and grief firsthand for the player. From beginning to end, the game provides a vast range of perspectives on grief. But here, we see one of its strongest opinions explicitly laid out through the forward-looking mentality of the expedition. After all, their whole purpose is to, at minimum, make discoveries and lay a path. So the response to Gustav's death is, well, tomorrow comes. That if something or someone is taken from your life, the experiences you've had with them still exist. They live on, in you and in their influence on the world. Honestly, Esquier says it better than me.
Losing a rock is better than never having a rock.
When you suffer a loss, you don't simply move on after enough time has passed. You just continue with your own life, carrying forward who or what you've lost along with you.
Death is not necessarily final.
What does that mean?
Gustav lives on in other ways, right? Through your memories, through his influence on your life and everyone else's, through the Lumina converter and his research.
These sentiments and perspectives on loss throughout the game would not be as sharp nor effective without having used the full extent of the medium to do so. Here, by using the gameplay to bolster the tension after the death of Gustav. If we really want to talk about how gameplay and narrative are braided together in this game though, I can't go any further without mentioning the ending. While the duelist fight presents one angle on how humans process grief, the ending asks you what your own angle is. Up until the very last moment of the playable game, Clair Obscur doesn't ever give you story choices which influence the sequence of events, outside of essentially flavor dialogue in camp conversations. The story is the story and you play alongside it. But then we get to the ending, and the player is conscripted into making just about the most high-stakes choice any character of the story ever makes: to destroy the canvas or let its existence continue. The two endings are in conversation with each other in a way that only video games can pull off, and the fact that this is a choice is one of the game's strongest statements about the flurry of questions it's been asking the whole time about grief, loss, and art. The conclusion of Clair Obscur Expedition 33 makes its reverence for the medium undeniable. This is the game attempting to be great art, opening up as a window again, but at the same time, its ability to reflect the ideas and perspectives of the player is just as strong here because of how it executes on synergizing gameplay and narrative, by forcing the player to contend with their values and emotions. In an interview with Gene Park from the Washington Post, creative director Guillaume Broche spoke about the sincerity of the team's work, stating, "There is a lot of joy and sincerity in how we made the game, and I think it's something players can connect with because we have soul in this game, and it's impossible to reproduce somewhere else without the team here." What Guillaume is highlighting here is that the game is an extension of its creators as much as it is an interrogation of its audience. The only reason the game is so effective at forcing reflection from its players is because it's such an open and honest insight into the people it stands for. As the game itself claims, this is what great art is, both window and mirror. The third and final act of Clair Obscur is, if you want it to be, by far the shortest. You can choose to immediately go straight to Lumiere to get on with the end of the game, or you can explore around the continent to finish the many remaining side quests. The most narratively substantial of these side quests are the missions that the expedition give to Verso at camp, like Minoko resurrecting Noko, or climbing up a towering axon for Mael to have a depressingly introspective moment with her painted counterpart. These sub-narratives all provide some small discussion about its emotional themes, mainly loss, from the perspective of each core character. I respect the confidence of letting the player go at these at their own discretion, but if you happen to skip these for the ending, the final moment lacks a lot of valuable context because it largely depends on you having been exposed to each character's viewpoints. But let's now look at the core pieces of the game's third act. It's revealed that everyone and everything is a painting in a canvas. Renoir was actually the one trying to erase the people in Lumiere, but as Mael merges with the dormant mind and memories of Alicia, she confronts her father, who's no longer trapped under the monolith now that the paintress has been defeated. Despite all the efforts that incidentally freed him, she tries to convince Renoir to let the canvas world live on, since it contains the people she grew to care about through her 16 years as Mael in Lumiere. Renoir's refusal spurs Mael to use her abilities as a painter to bring back Lune and Ciel. This is where we get the S-tier Clair Obscur quote: "Painting isn't about verisimilitude, it's about essence." And then the expedition continues on back to Lumiere to now stop Renoir from completely erasing everything. The group fights through Renoir's painted army, charging through Lumiere, a city turned to a battlefield. At the final confrontation, under the distorted Eiffel Tower, the expedition whittle Renoir down in a multi-staged climactic set-piece encounter, with best-of moments in the form of his painted axons being summoned as boss moves. It's a really cool fight. But then the fight concludes with a high-stakes conversation between Mael and her father, Verso watching tentatively. Each plead their case. Renoir simply wants his family back. Being in the canvas drains the life from a painter, and he's been watching his wife fade more and more the longer she's been distracting herself from reality. And now it's happening to Mael too. Mael, though, all she wants is to live a life with her friends and her brother, as real to her as anything outside the canvas. To live a life free of the scars that prevent her from vouching for herself in the real world. So Renoir concedes, too heartbroken to keep trying to make decisions for his daughter that she doesn't want. So he leaves the canvas. But nothing is this simple in Clair Obscur, and what follows is painted Verso entering the boundary between the real and painted worlds to find the soul of the real Verso, who has been sustaining the subjects of the canvas the entire time. The continent, Esquier, the Gestrels, but also Lumiere and its people, harshly superimposed upon his creations by his mother after he died. Painted Verso decides now he'd rather free his counterpart's soul from the canvas now violated by Aline's pain and longing. Mael follows into the boundary, contesting his decision, and this is where the game now hands the reins over to the player. Do you force Verso's soul to keep painting and painted Verso to keep living, or allow him to end things on his own terms? To understand how we get to this point, where Verso suddenly chooses to do things his way after just helping the expedition catch up to Renoir, we have to dig a bit deeper into Verso's tragic character, because in life, death, and in spirit, he hasn't exactly had the best run. Growing up in the Descendre family, everyone had their own attachments to various art forms, but Aline and Renoir didn't support their children's desire for anything but painting. There's an implication of a political conflict between different art guilds, the writers versus the painters, and Mael, drawn to writing, felt the need to associate with the writers behind her parents' back, and this is what ultimately escalated to the fire that took Verso's life. While Verso was alive though, he fell in love with the art of music, dreaming of performing for full auditoriums, but he was made to paint, and crushingly, that's not where his heart was.
Every time I play, it feels like my heart's about to break from the beauty of the notes.
So, in life, he was confined to live absent of choice, a musician, forced to paint. And after his death, not much changed. His soul maintaining the canvas is also a deeply tragic and conflicted character. He paints in perpetuity, lest Aline lose him a second time. Now, there's a lot of completely optional side dungeons in the game. One of the hardest and most significant story-wise is the Flying Manor. It reveals a huge amount of information about the painted version of Clair. There's a lot going on here, but for me, it's one of the most significant areas of the game for what it reveals about young Verso. These fading people you find around the continent are the remnant souls of the painters who have contributed to the canvas. A fragment of real Verso, much like the one in the Boundary, exists at the Flying Manor. He says to the expedition, talking about painted Clair, "Painting or not, she had feelings and a soul. That's what I think at least, but I know she thinks differently. For me, everything in this canvas is as much alive as what is outside. Esquier, the Gestrels, the Grandis, even Aline's paintings. I welcome them all. Painting should be a celebration, just like music." So, it's easy to conclude that the fragment of Verso's soul in the canvas wants the painted world to carry on, right? Well, in the final advance through Lumiere towards the ending, you'll come across more instances of young Verso's soul. Here, he questions whether he should keep painting at all, and indicates that, actually, he might even support what painted Verso intends to do. In reality then, Verso's spirit is deeply divided, and I think this is a really common misconception about the ending of the game. It's easy to see painted Verso and young Verso's soul as having the same motivations right at the ending, but this would be a misinterpretation. Yes, his spirit slouches exhaustedly over the canvas while painted Verso promises to free him from painting. But his soul has equally expressed a deep level of empathy and love for everything in the canvas, even the additions from his family. Verso's trapped soul and the Verso painted by Aline that you play as through the game are two different people with independent perspectives. Spirit Verso is conflicted, unsure about what the fate of the canvas should be. Painted Verso, on the other hand, is more decisive. He's been painted with his flaws, manipulative and compelled to solve his problems by lying. But the one time he's completely honest and unfiltered is if you choose Mael's ending and he's forced back into the canvas, begging that he doesn't want this life, the one full of trauma and empty of agency.
Please. I don't want this life.
Stop saying that.
I don't want this life. I don't want this life.
But this represents only one half of what Verso's soul wants. The other half, well, that's Mael. Keep painting and let the canvas live on. The duality that permeates the game culminates here. The two choices, Verso and Mael, are equally the two sides of the conflict between Aline and Renoir, and young Verso is caught in the middle, the rope in a tragic tug of war. No more than in any other part of the game is this more clear than in everyone's favourite new JRPG rock ballad, Une vie à t'aimer. This is the track that plays over the end of Act 2 fight with painted Renoir. Yeah, the sick one that goes like this. Conveniently, I do speak a little bit of French, but I didn't really catch the significance of this song until I sat down and really listened. It's easy to just rock out to this absolute banger. But after paying attention to the lyrics, this is a deeply poetic song that reveals the emotions driving the core conflict of the game, the fractured love between Aline and Renoir, complicated by the loss of Verso. Now, you don't need to speak French to notice that there are two vocalists here, a man and a woman. The vocalists plead to each other while the expedition attempts to push through painted Renoir's last-ditch defense of the paintress. But remember, this Renoir in the boss battle is bound to the canvas. The vocalists in Une vie à t'aimer reflect the emotional struggle between real Renoir and his wife. Throughout the ballad, the two vocalists sing to each other. And then sometimes they're singing at each other. but ultimately, they sing about how much they tragically love each other. This poetic conversation, in context with the narrative, is just heartbreaking. Aline and Renoir love each other and Verso, and they're begging each other to listen, unable to agree on how to use Verso's canvas. A verse of the song describes Aline, Renoir, Alicia, and Verso all au Clair Obscur, in Clair Obscur style. That is to say, all people with contrasting personalities. I hear this verse as a request to not judge any one character for their perspectives, but to try and empathize with them. How everyone's rationale is the love they have for their family, simply expressed in different ways. I mean, just look at Renoir's interpretation of the beauty he sees in Aline as he painted the axons. Sirene, she who plays with wonder. Compelled to put meaning into each of his brushstrokes, Renoir paints a beautifully mesmerizing dancing puppet made of long flowing ribbons of cloth. She sings the most elegant song in the game, and though Sirene lures people to their demise with her grace and beauty, Renoir shows that regardless of what she does and how hard she pushes away, he can't help remaining not only in love with his wife, but head over heels infatuated with her, and he's broken because of it.
She walks her path, and I walk mine. I don't exist to her. None of us do. She's left us all behind to drown by ourselves so that she can drown alone.
Hence, why, even though he understands that all those in the canvas are thinking, feeling people who deserve empathy.
Your friends speak truth, and it changes nothing.
His one and only goal is to have his family back. But it's not as though Aline misunderstands Renoir either, nor has she stopped caring for him. She's just unable to piece herself together after the death of Verso, and wants to grieve alone. Let's not forget, Aline has been painting her interpretations of her family into the canvas as well. While painted Renoir stands in the way of the expedition throughout the majority of the game, he only does so to protect his family in the canvas. Just look at the tense encounter that occurs between the expedition and Renoir at the base of the monolith. To try and make things, well, less confusing, I'll clarify that I'm talking about 3 different Renoirs here. There's real-world Renoir, who doesn't appear in the scene. He's trapped underneath the monolith and doesn't emerge until the paintress is defeated. Then there's painted Renoir, made by Aline, originally to be part of the Descendre family in Lumiere. And finally, there's the Curator. Much like the spirit of Verso sustaining the canvas, he's a fragment of real Verso's soul. So Spirit Renoir, or the Curator, holds the same feelings and motivations as his real-world counterpart. When the expedition reaches the base of the monolith, they bring the Curator with them, as he carries the power to eliminate painted Renoir. This is actually the first time they've ever met, and painted Renoir is faced with himself and thus his family being erased from the canvas. So what does he do here? He doesn't plea for himself. He doesn't curse the attempt on his life. He appeals to the very thing he knows real Renoir would care about: his family.
This is all you have left of your son.
The Curator doesn't have a face for expression, but you can still see him take pause, looking out longingly before taking his daughter's hand. It's clear he isn't taking any pleasure whatsoever in erasing painted Renoir here, and as the Curator removes him, his painted counterpart says,
I love them too.
This is a man who wanted nothing else but to live alongside his family, who understood that his pain was the same as that felt by the real-world Renoir. And the most brutal part of it all, this is the Renoir painted by Aline. She understands everything her husband is feeling, and yet still can't bear to leave the canvas. And remember, this scene occurs before the player has even been shown the reality behind the canvas. The moment secretly distills the game's whole core conflict, a conflict rooted not in some grand external threat, but in the internal struggles of a single broken family. Once you get to the final moment of the game, where you're forced to choose between Verso or Maëlle, Renoir or Aline, You've already been subtly shown each corresponding perspective across the run of the entire game, and it's up to you which one feels more right. Now, I've been reading people's opinions about this game for months at this point, and this moment of the game is its most discussed and controversial part. People are very vocal about what the more correct choice is, willing to die on one of these two hills. So, who's right here? Well, first we have to establish exactly what Mael and Verso each stand for personally. Verso, of course, wants to destroy the canvas and, incidentally, its inhabitants along with it. His motivation? We saw it earlier. He doesn't want to live his life. You could read this as, perhaps, a selfish decision. As he's forced back into the canvas, he doesn't plea for Mael or Aline's sake, he pleads for himself. This doesn't mean he doesn't care about anyone else, of course. Verso is a complex and three-dimensional character. There's a lot going on. He cares about his sister and real-world mother. After all, Aline painted him with the love and memories of the original Verso. So he stands for the love of family, but also for a chance at autonomy, a single choice of his own, even if it'll be his last. His ending, titled Une vie à t'aimer, a life to love, has the Descendres together again, but still broken over Verso, Alicia without a voice, and the people of Lumiere erased. It's bittersweet. Choosing Mael, on the other hand, forces Verso's soul to keep painting, but saves the lives within the canvas, and it's easy to believe her intentions are pure as well. But when she bargains with her father, saying that she'll eventually return, she's lying. And Verso can tell. I have no doubt that seeing himself in Mael as she's actively deceiving Renoir has no small part in solidifying his final decision. Mael's ending is dryly cynical. The expeditioners fill the opera hall to watch Verso perform against his will, Mael falling into the same spiral as her mother. Her motivations are equally complex. She does talk about saving the canvas's lives when bargaining with her father, but like Verso, she's not entirely selfless either. She says explicitly that she doesn't want to return to her scarred body outside the canvas. The people I see die on the Verso Hill make an argument similar to that of Renoir, that seeing a family torn apart by abusing an unhealthy coping mechanism, one that literally kills them the more that they use it, just isn't okay. It's not sustainable. The people in the canvas go through constant grief and misery at the hands of Aline, and there's no way of knowing if it will ever end. And trapping both painted Verso and Verso's soul into a lifetime of service to the canvas isn't justifiable. Any other choice will make peace for the Descendres and every version of Verso still remaining impossible. And it's not like any of this is wrong. So how does the Mael crowd justify their decision? The argument goes something like this. The lives inside the canvas are just as real as any other, so there's no moral justification for doing anything else but saving them, even if poor Verso has to paint forever. And to be clear, I agree with the premise. If today you suddenly discovered beyond any doubt that you lived in a computer simulation, would you live your life any different tomorrow? Would the world be any less real to you? Certainly, most would continue on as they were. Not only that, but the game's story itself pretty much takes the same stance. The soul fragment of young Verso himself talks about how he sees the canvas as a real world full of life worth celebrating. In Clair Obscur, the people in the canvas are not just ink to paper, code to a CPU, or light passing through a film reel. They're more than that, at least according to the kid whose existence we're choosing to uphold or not. Even in the Verso ending, Mael/Alicia still carries her experiences from the canvas into the real world. Experiences in the canvas are real, no matter how you cut it. But let's remember, neither Mael nor Verso's intentions are 100% pure. I see some people claim that in choosing Mael's ending, perhaps she's destined to find another way, as the letter from Painted Alicia believes she can.
But perhaps you'll find another way. You who have lived amongst us. Perhaps you differ from your father and your sister, as I differ from mine. Your mother paints life, whilst your father, death. What will you paint?
The two endings, Une vie à t'aimer and Une vie à peindre, match the titles of the songs that play during the narratively climactic boss fights. But there's a third song fitting this category titled Une vie à rêver, a life to dream. Not to get all Illuminati here, but each of the three songs are 11 minutes long, so together they're a poetic 33 minutes of music. Not only that, but the song Une vie à t'aimer, a life to love, plays during the painted Renoir boss fight before defeating the Paintress. This is what Verso's ending, carrying the same title, aims for. And then, in much the same way, Une vie à peindre, a life to paint, plays in the Act 3 boss fight with real Renoir, corresponding to Maël's decision to maintain the canvas. And then, interestingly, Une vie à rêver, a life to dream, plays at the top of the Reacher axon as Maël and painted Alicia talk to each other. With all of this then, you could think Une vie à rêver points to an elusive perfect ending, matching the one that painted Alicia believes in. But the reality is, this is not the ending we get by choosing Maël. She does not find another way. She becomes lost in the void of the canvas, just like her mother. So we're back to the question at hand. What is the right choice? I might get a bit of pushback on this, but I truly believe both choices are equally right and wrong, and not in a fence-sitting way, but in the way that the game frames each ending as an impossible balance of two valid but incompatible perspectives. The choice comes down to what you, the player, believes is the lesser of two evils in two deeply flawed choices, which is going to depend on your own life and your own experiences.
We're all hypocrites, doing the same thing to each other.
One thing I'll give to Team Maël, and I think this is a big reason there's so much disagreement about the ending at all, is that the literal read of the ending, to erase the people in the canvas versus reuniting the Descendre family in the real world, honestly does feel kind of like it under-interrogates the genocide aspect of the whole bargain. Lune and Ciel say their part to Renoir, but it's a fraction of the discussion that sets the stage for the game's conclusion, instead focusing mostly on the Descendre family and their own feelings, desires, and perspectives on the matter. But that's because there's a higher level metaphorical read that takes precedent here in the writing. The structure of the ending weakens the impact of the choice a bit, but it allows the metaphorical subtext of the ending to be stronger. You see, I have to make another confession, again. I've buried the lead one more time on why the symbolism of duality has such a strong presence throughout Clair Obscur. That's 2 layers deep if you're counting. Now, I swear this is the last time, because the game is, no doubt at all, a universal conversation about grief and loss. Not even just in the context of death, but a whole range of things like friendship, family ties, life opportunities, a sense of belonging. There's a lot to the story. But the window of Clair Obscur reveals a deeper buried thought, one about the very nature and role of art. Buckle up, because we're about to get meta. One of the most influential pieces of writing in the world of literary theory is the 1967 essay written by French literary philosopher and critic Roland Barthes, titled La mort de l'auteur, the death of the author. Now, this isn't my typical bag, so I promise I'll keep this brief, and helpfully, the essay here is a very short read. It only takes about 10 minutes to get through, but the poise of its writing motivated a massive shift in the way analysis of cultural text was handled in the late 20th century. Up until this point, the conventional approach to literary analysis was a biographical one. That is, artistic criticism was undertaken with the idea that it was possible to discover a singularly correct ground truth meaning of a text via the author's intent. In The Death of the Author, Barthes argues that the author's intent mindset severely limits the ability for an audience or a critic to extract meaning from a work. In his words, that doing so imposes upon that text a stop clause. By calling into question the infallibility of language to convey an exact original intent in the first place, he rejects the possibility that there is an objective closed-form interpretation of a text, of any output of a creative medium. He writes, in the translation by Richard Howard, We know that a text does not consist of a line of words releasing a single theological meaning, the message of the author god, but is a space of many dimensions, in which are wedded and contested various kinds of writing, no one of which is original. And continuing the theological analogy, literature, by refusing to assign to the text a secret, that is, an ultimate meaning, liberates an activity which we might call counter-theological, properly revolutionary, for to refuse to arrest meaning is finally to refuse God and his hypostases, reason, science, the law. This evocative metaphor between author and God, and the call to dethrone the author as the deity of their writing, suggests that by validating a reader's interpretation, there could be an incredible shift of power towards the audience. The essay famously concludes with Bart saying, "The birth of the reader must be ransomed by the death of the author." Publishing The Death of the Author genuinely did incite a kind of power shift in literary criticism in exactly this way, and modern literary academia still acknowledges Bart's ideas today. But there have also been many counter-criticisms. Bart's writing argues that empowering the audience's interpretations requires completely dethroning the author god. But how could it be possible that any individual's interpretation is equally valid, regardless of the intertextual evidence they provide? Realistically, based on the way literary analysis is conducted today, both author and audience provide valid meaning to a text. There is an extent to which the power of art can be attributed to the artist, but all the same, once a piece of creative work has been put out into the world, the audience also shares a portion of this power in their own interpretation through the experiences and perspectives they bring to the table. Death of the author is just a tool of textual analysis, just as authorial intent is. So, if this is all true, that there is validity to Bart's claims that the unity of a text is not in its origin, it is in its destination, then it all starts to raise the question, to whom does art belong? If an author's interpretation of their work is not superior to that of the reader's, does the meaning of the art belong to the reader rather than the artist who has poured their own blood, sweat, and tears, their soul, into the work? When taken in its broader strokes, this is exactly the question Clair Obscur welcomes, openly and directly. If the game wasn't already French enough as it is, they couldn't help themselves but to go and make the whole high-level concept of the damn thing a response to one of the most influential contributions the French have had to literary theory. Now, if you're still not convinced, maybe thinking, okay, this guy needs to stop showing how he ruins parties and start talking about the video game again, well, how about this? In Clair Obscur, while Verso is growing up, he originally paints the canvas that the whole game takes place in. Right as Verso dies in the fire, that is, the literal death of the canvas's author takes place, his grand artistic creation, the continent and everything in it, becomes an open text. It is immediately appropriated and reinterpreted by those who remain. Renoir, Aline, and Claire all paint their own things into the canvas based on their own goals. And even the people of Lumiere, thinking, feeling people, transform the original intent of Verso's creation in how it becomes a home for a whole city of inhabitants. Each character in the game, driven by their own grief, desires, and moral compasses, imbues Verso's art with a new purpose, entirely unique to them. So, if we now look back to the controversy surrounding the endgame choices between Mael and Painted Verso, but now through the lens of what it means when the player brings all their baggage to the table, there's a much larger point to be made than addiction bad or genocide wrong. To have any perspective on the ending, whether it be based on grief, sympathy, or morality, is to have successfully engaged with this game on its terms. As great art, you've seen the game as a mirror, carrying on past the death of the author, past what exists in the game's figurative window. This is why if you leave a YouTube comment on a Clair Obscur video saying something like, "The sweet melancholy of Verso's ending brought a tear to my eye," you'll receive a flurry of personal insults with the same energy as a subreddit mod losing their mind because someone called the sky blue instead of periwinkle. Because the tendency to choose one ending over the other is less about weighing up who's right and who's wrong, and rather mostly to do with who you empathize more with. This final choice is much like the game's final exam, set out in front of you only after you've been bombarded with a whole range of perspectives containing the rationale and flaws behind both decisions. But the game here doesn't have a correct answer. Both endings are intentionally flawed, each bittersweet or cynical in some way. So the exam is not testing you to see whether you figured out some seeded lesson. When you're sitting there, deliberating on which narrative conclusion to lock in, the game is trusting you to be introspective, to look inward. The game will not choose your values for you. And so, there is no canon ending. Much like an author's intent does not conceive a singular ground truth interpretation, there is no singularly correct option here at the end of Clair Obscur. Instead, the whole game exists in concert with both endings. When I got to this point on my first playthrough, I stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity, paralysed with an indecision between two ostensibly wrong answers from two very convicted people. And I have to choose? Well, I thought about the expedition, all the experiences, memories, love and loss, with Lune, Ciel and Gustave, and yeah, it felt a bit wrong, but I went with Maëlle. And boy, did I regret it. Both endings of this game, and arguably more so Maëlle's, call you the fuck out. Now, after spending an ungodly amount of time researching, writing, and talking about this game, I don't preference one ending over the other. But when first faced with a choice, after having just thought really hard, assessing whether I should care more about the Descendre family or the contents of the canvas, the ambiguous morality of both conclusions forced me to reflect even deeper. It immediately questions whether what you chose was right, whether you regret the decision, and more importantly, if you do want to hit reset, well, why? The ending flattens the whole journey of the game into a single moment of reflection, and at that moment, it is entirely a mirror. You know, a while after finishing the game, I happened to be looking at Reddit, to find anyone who had the audacity to call the sky blue. No, I was actually on the Expedition 33 subreddit, and I came across what I found to be a really interesting post. It's about how much this guy is just furious with Maëlle. They say, Maëlle, maybe it's because I come from a family of addicts, maybe it's because I'm an addict myself, but there's no mistaking the behaviours. She will do or say literally anything to stay in the canvas, and she will never stop exerting her painter's will over the people who live there. Do you really think she will ever really let Verso go? Maëlle is not concerned with agency. She is an addict, and she will get her fix one way or another. And then, all the way at the bottom, they end with, I guess this post probably says more about me than the game. And since then, I've never seen such a pointed demonstration of Clair Obscur's ability to solicit self-aware reflection. If you've reached the fated conclusion of Clair Obscur yourself, no doubt you have your own interpretations and experiences that playing the game will have drawn out of you beyond what Sandfall ever explicitly intended. Your own creations within the canvas. These might be things like dealing with disability, with addiction, it could be complicated family relations, the pain of loss, or entirely something else. Any one of these things is just as valid as another. That's why there's no correct ending. Once the art is made, no one has control over what you see in its mirror. Maybe someone playing the game comes from a family of addicts and they can't bear to see Maëlle throw everything away for the intoxicating allure of a better life inside the canvas. It doesn't mean they approve of genocide, it just means they reflected on what was important in their own life. Likewise, if someone feels they've been controlled by their family their whole life, and in Maëlle they see a reach towards self-agency, for the voices in their head to be their own, then it doesn't mean that they think the real world is worth discarding in a fit of nihilism. We're not born with a decision on what the correct ending is. It comes from how we're shaped by the trials and tribulations of life. Now, it's also important to remember that in the canvas, the author isn't entirely dead. A fragment of Verso's spirit still paints endlessly in the void, keeping the canvas alive. And in Clair Obscur Expedition 33, the real-life game, it's impossible to deny that the humanity that's been poured into every creative endeavour that makes it up isn't a massive reason why the game strikes a chord with so many who have played it. The life experiences of Jennifer and Guillaume come out in their writing, and will absolutely influence the way a player interprets the game. Once the game released, and everyone realised what a home run Sandfall had hit, the interviews started rolling in, and refreshingly honest ones at that. Jennifer has spoken a lot about how many of the core ideas in the narrative are taken directly from aspects of her own life. About, for instance, how the characters in the expedition are written from moments of her past.
Working on their backstories, a lot of times I would pull in a lot of things from my own personal experiences, my own different parts of my own life. So for instance, for Maëlle, since she's younger, she's 16, and we did want her to feel a little bit more like a loner, separate from the rest of Lumiere, in part because that serves the story, right? Because there is a part of her subconscious that is telling her, wake up, this is not real, you don't belong here. And for that, I drew a lot on my own personal experiences as a teen. You know, a lot of the lines actually come from my own life in that sense, which sounds a little like, but you know, when she says, you know, I just feel like there's something everybody else gets that I just don't like understand, like, and feeling like you never belong, like that's from my own sort of teens. When Gustav is very idealistic about, you know, trying to do more for the world, that I also drew a lot from my own personal idealism. Lune, for example, I drew from like my own academic experiences and also my experiences working in finance and growing up in a Chinese household with a lot of weight of responsibility and expectations.
If any of this feels like it makes the characters click for you like they didn't before, then you could argue that the consideration of an authorial biographical contribution to the work is important to its overall meaning. I certainly haven't been subtle about it. I have plenty of personal perspectives on the game. It's half the reason why I'm talking about it right now. Playing the game and then watching interviews with its creators has got me thinking about things like, all this time, what Final Fantasy VIII meant to me retrospectively, about my own relationships with my family, and many of the lost opportunities that have passed me by in life. And ultimately, I've considered how all of these things affect my views and who I am today. And on those thoughts, I'd be lying if I said looking into the background of Sandfall didn't help me feel validated in some way, feeling a sense of connection through common ideals and experiences. Art connects an audience's background to the background of its authors, which is why being able to see the passion in the form of the work is so effective. That's why, in the Washington Post interview I mentioned, Guillaume describes the reason why he thinks the game resonates with people so well by saying, "We have soul in this game, and it's impossible to reproduce somewhere else without the team here." The game is a representative form of those who made it. This is what gives Clair Obscur its window into its authors, because there's no mask to filter the true souls of the people who put the game together. You can only feel seen by a work of art if there's someone there to actually see you. It's the same reason why it's so hard to feel a connection with AI art. AI-generated stuff, if used beyond the context of just a tool that is, simply cannot be great art at all, since it can't be a window into anything, except, I guess, a set of instructions. So even if Master Chief writing a roast chicken like a horse, for whatever reason, gets you to think about the world in new ways, there is still nothing to connect with on the other side. Its very nature prohibits it from ever being both mirror and window. So that's the whole message, right? That great art is both window and mirror, a story of its creators, and a place for an audience's life experience to form new stories. But then we circle back to the question, who owns it? Who gets to point at the emotional revolution the ending brings about and say, that's mine? Does a playthrough of Clair Obscur belong to me, or Sandfall? Should Maëlle get to do what she wants in Verso's canvas, or does he get the final say? I haven't tried to obscure what I believe the answer is here. Both parties bring something different but substantial to the table, but crucially, art resonates the strongest when the two pieces are in harmony. You can look at what happens in Clair Obscur when these two parts clash. That's what's happening throughout the entire narrative as Aline and Renoir wage their emotional war in the canvas. They're trying to do what they think is necessary, but they simply don't see eye to eye, and by the time we're having to make an impossible choice between two tragic endings, it's already far too late. The painters in the canvas by this point, beginning with Real Verso's inception of the world, followed by Aline and then by Renoir, Clair and Maëlle, bring together their contributions which all gratingly clash, and the art begets suffering. And so there cannot be a life of dreams, only tragedy. Symbolic duality is so present throughout Clair Obscur because its fundamental question is about the tension that must be balanced between artist and audience, since there are two sides to humanity's relationship to art. Audience and author, recto and verso, clair and obscur. Thus, art belongs to both, each in different ways. I hope this far in, I've made it clear that in all my subjectivity, I believe Clair Obscur is great art. There's also something to be said about how well this game adheres to its own definition of great art, the window and mirror thing. It gives us a framework that's a little less arbitrary in which to talk about its achievements. But I also said a lot of people call this a masterpiece, something that usually only happens when a lot of different things are all done exceptionally well. Well, a clearer hallmark of a masterpiece, for me at least, is to see whether people are still talking about it in 5, 10, or however many decades to come. Well, I don't have a crystal ball, but people are really talking about this game right now. It makes people reflect and look introspectively. There's no shortage of discussions like that going around. But what happens a lot less, even for very well-received games, is that people are talking almost as much about the story of how Clair Obscur was made. I believe the game is great art, but I also believe it has everything it needs to be a masterpiece because it's such a fascinating window and such an effective mirror. There will no doubt be people discussing this game for a long time to come. You know, as I was writing the opening of this script, I started questioning why I ever even kept my copy of Final Fantasy VIII across a half different moves into new apartments if a PS1 can't even read its discs anymore. I've taken it with me my whole life, and yeah, I guess I am just a bit sentimental, but what does that even mean? Playing through Expedition 33, I've realised that the content on the disc, the music, the cutscenes, the code, are only part of its story to me. It shaped my relationship with games and popular culture before almost anything else. If I hadn't played Final Fantasy VIII, this video almost certainly wouldn't exist. And sure, in a general sense, if it wasn't this, it'd have probably just been the next thing that came along. But it was this, and I am me, and so the scratches that prevent it from playing don't erase those years of meaning, and it's nice to have something tangible that reminds me of all those things. The canvas is gone, but my experiences are not. It's also helped me to understand where a game like Expedition 33 comes from. Every piece of art that altered the course of those who worked on Clair Obscur is responsible for it turning out exactly as it did. I've heard a lot of recounts from people expressing how Clair Obscur has made them want to go and do something new and creative. I wouldn't be surprised in the slightest to see Clair Obscur on someone's own inspiration list in the not too distant future. New generations are always reinterpreting the art they grew up with, and the cycle will continue. No different to how the 5 explorers in Expedition 33 only succeeded from the trail laid by the expeditions before them. How Expedition 35 used their final moments to create a literal bridge with their bodies. How Expedition 69 left behind the very valuable handholds that future expeditions used to advance across the continent. Or how Expedition 67 blasted the holes through Seren's Colosseum, becoming the only path forward to the Axon. And even within Expedition 33 itself, the group would never have made it to the monolith were it not for Gustav's luminar inventions. Art creates lasting change that lives on long after its origins are gone. This is what rings in my mind when I hear the phrase, "We continue." From start to end, Clair Obscur is always committed to the essence of art, and not just through the literal symbolism of canvases and paintbrushes. Whether it's the way it reinterprets the artistic media which have inspired it, or how it uses our shared humanity to help us look inwards, it's always trying, in some way, to open up how we see the world. This is what makes Clair Obscur great art. In great art, the audience must see their own perspectives reflected, and yes, for this, the proverbial author has to die. But at the same time, the creator cannot be taken completely out of the picture. Their soul must remain, which can only happen if they put their whole unmasked passions and ideals, their selves, into the work. Only then can a meaningful two-way conversation with the art take place. You remember that interview I brought up between Guillaume Broche and Gene Park at the Washington Post? Well, I didn't quite get the full quote out. What he says is, "There's a lot of joy and sincerity in how we made the game, and I think it's something players can connect with because we have soul in this game, and it's impossible to reproduce somewhere else without the team here. We are emptied out. There is all of us in the game. Nothing left." Whew, wow. Okay. Welcome to the Illustrious End of Video section. Firstly, I want to say thanks so much for watching. This was the most work I've ever put into a single video by far. It's also the most fun I've had making one. I tried to do this game as much justice as I could, and I just hope that you got something out of it. If you did, you can let me know by leaving a like or even leaving a comment. Just a few things. If you happen to be new to the channel, welcome, it's great to have you. If you aren't new to the channel, you might have noticed I haven't uploaded in a while. I've had a lot going on recently, I've moved house, I've been working on a doctoral thesis this past year, that took quite some time, and I also spent quite a bit of time making this video. But all of that stuff is done now, so I'm very excited to make a lot more videos like this again, though maybe not quite so long. Admittedly, this one got a little bit out of hand, but trust me, you should see the stuff I cut out of it. Anyway, if you want to see more stuff like this, the best way you can support me is by subscribing. It's a small effort, but it makes a huge difference for me. In any case, thanks for sticking around this far. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you next time.